Last episode, I tried to secure the Screen Australia development grant for my indie game, Project Feline, and it didn't quite go according to plan. We did a 3-week crunch to prepare a submission, which included a demo and a ton of paperwork. We then had to wait 2 months to hear back, and then another 2 weeks to be sent the contract, which was so poorly written that we withdrew our application and asked to be reimbursed our legal costs. They instead offered us a cash settlement with a non-disparagement clause. When we declined this as well, they threatened to closely monitor my public communications. You can find out more about the saga in my previous devlog. But while all that was going on, there was another battle on the horizon. Project Feline is a game about momentum, where players can infinitely gain speed by chaining together slides, grinds, and wall runs. But with great speed comes great challenge, and the greatest challenge for me as a character artist has been building environments large enough to facilitate Gabby in a full game experience that lasts for more than 15 minutes. At the very beginning of development, I made a handful of stages. These were mostly linear and had to span multiple kilometers in size just to contain Gabby for a few minutes. As development continued during my grant submission, I decided to take the level design towards a semi-open world direction, with the stages consisting of explorable zones that the player would unlock as they progress through a narrative, like the levels in Super Mario Odyssey or a Ratchet & Clank game. I believed this new semi-open world structure would allow me to develop a longer game in a shorter time span, with smaller but denser environments, making the most use out of the smallest possible space. I had to crunch a bit to make the submission deadline, so I hired a level designer to help build the Abandoned Port as a demonstration of this open level design. In this stage, Gabby is on the run and must navigate the abandoned port and escape to the city. This was the longest yet smallest stage in the game so far. To increase playtime, the environment had been segmented into 3 explorable areas, connected via large gates placed at the entrances. To open these gates, players would need to explore for hidden switches while avoiding obstacles and enemies. However, at the time of the grant submission, we only had time to polish one of these segments, and immediately afterwards, work began on fleshing out the rest. Building a stage like this usually takes place over 5 phases: blocking, meshing, lighting, audio, and polishing gameplay. The blocking of these segments had been designed by my contractor a couple months prior. He then used a technique called kit bashing to replace these grid textures with proper meshes, sourcing assets from the Unreal Marketplace and the Quixel Megascans library. I designed a post-processing stack that would render on top of the camera, which applied color grading, bloom, and paint filters to the environment, helping to give it that anime look. To light these segments, we used a single baked directional light and an ambient bounce light from this anime skybox. Normally, with real-time lighting, the light and shadows for every object has to be calculated for each pixel every frame. Real-time lighting has made huge leaps in recent years, but usually requires cutting-edge hardware to look the best. Light baking is a process by which the light and shadows are pre-calculated and projected onto the scene before runtime. While this means the lighting is fixed and the shadows can't move, the quality is much higher and saves considerable performance. Once lit, we then filled the stage with enemies, obstacles, and collectibles, which I had made during the grant submission. I then put in some background music, and now the abandoned port was fully playable start to end. After clearing the first gate, the stage narrows into a tight gauntlet, where Gabby must wall run while carefully avoiding lasers to reach the other side. This route then opens to a warehouse full of collectibles and enemies, with the path ahead sealed by another gate with a hidden switch. This gate then opens to a grind rail leading to the end of the mission with a view of her next destination. I then invited some friends to playtest this for me, and on average, the stage took them about 15 minutes to complete. And I was so happy to finally have a stage that looked this good and lasted over a few minutes. However, I could sense that there was something wrong. One of the reasons players took longer to complete the stage than my previous ones was because they would often get stuck, whether trying to get around an obstacle or trying to find a gate switch. The density of obstacles made players tread more slowly, and thus nobody took full advantage of Gabby's momentum mechanics. So, while the stage was made in under a month, fully meshed and lit, and 15 minutes in length, and met all of my goals on paper, it wasn't as fun to play as I'd initially hoped, and lacked much of the magic present in the previous stages. But I didn't want to give up on this stage just yet, so I studied it carefully to make improvements. Once again, trying to make the most use out of the smallest possible space. I was really stuck for ideas, so I looked through my catalog of games for inspiration, and found a game that does this exceedingly well. and that game is Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3. The goal of the Tony Hawk's Pro Skater games is to perform tricks and combos to earn the highest score possible. Players can use half pipes and ramps to gain airtime, where they can perform flips, spins, and grabs. Players can also grind on rails to maintain their combo, but if the player bails and fails to land correctly, their score combo is lost. In the game's campaign mode, each level has 5 objectives that must be completed to unlock the next area. Optional objectives can also be completed to unlock characters, cheats, and skater customizations. I'm a bit of a completionist when it comes to video games, so of course I tried to complete everything on this checklist. And before I knew it, I'd spent over 2 hours in just the first level, trying to get a 6 score, grind the molten bucket, and find the secret tape. I was amazed at how much playtime the game could squeeze from just one level, a level significantly smaller than the ones we had made for Gabby. And I was curious if I could incorporate these smaller levels and a goal list into Project Feline, believing this structure could shrink the game's scope and help me ship something faster. Something which I now took very seriously, anticipating the funding milestones I would be beholden to as a prospective grant recipient. At the time, I had already sent my grant submission, but in the interest of being transparent, I wrote up a new design document and production schedule detailing this new direction and promising an earlier deadline. While writing these documents, I had trouble picturing what this would look like, and I struggled to come up with ideas for these level goals. I designed a mock-up loading screen in Photoshop depicting what a Tony Hawk-style goal list would look like in Project Feline. But none of these felt authentic to my game, and I couldn't explain why. I soon discovered that while the skaters and Gabby have some overlap, like physical momentum and rail grinding, they have key fundamental differences, which influence the types of environments they're best suited to. These differences mainly stemming from the presence of skateboards. In Tony Hawk's, this makes even simple player movement a challenge, and performing turns and jumps requires a degree of care. Gabby's handling, by comparison, is much more generous. She has tighter turns and more responsive air control, but she can't perform ollies, kick flips, manuals, or McTwists. More importantly, she can't bail. And in Tony Hawk's, it's this possibility of failure that gives you that thrilling feeling, sitting on the edge of your seat as you execute a 20-move combo and scramble to land the right way up. Without bailing, there are no stakes. Without stakes, there is no challenge. And this is what makes skaters fun, even when confined to a small space and given nothing to do except rack up points and collect hidden tapes. Conversely, Gabby is most fun when she has somewhere to go, which makes her harder to contain in such a small level. So, while the economic level design of Tony Hawk's was alluring, I just couldn't make it work with Gabby's current movement, and then begged the question, do I completely overhaul the movement to work with these smaller levels? And that's when I knew I had gone too far. I had twice already refactored the movement, and to do so again would cost considerable time, a resource which I was carefully trying to conserve. Besides, players already enjoyed the current mechanics, and to mold Gabby into a pro skater would take away from what made my game unique. So I knew that this was a line I probably shouldn't cross. But then how was I going to make enough level content within a reasonable time frame to make a full game? I didn't know yet, but I realized that the level design and game structure needed to be tailored to Gabby, not the other way around. My contract level designer was thinking the same, and it secretly made not 1, but 2 new level blockouts, similar to the linear stages I had made earlier in development, except these new stages were much bigger, but made in much less time. How did he do it? Well, let's take a look. While I haven't talked about it much, I've been diligently working on a narrative to tie my levels and characters together. It's gone through many revisions, but they all start with Gabby held captive in a secret laboratory, where she must escape from in the first stage. And the first of these new stages depicted this laboratory. While it's hard to tell from the interiors, this is the largest stage in the game so far, featuring tall walls, steep ramps, and high-stakes grind rail segments, giving Gabby plenty of room to build momentum. We even added some test dialogue throughout the stage to give players a semblance of the plot as Gabby made her escape. The second stage was an exterior, and experimented with using Unreal's terrain tools. It's difficult to find inspiration for exteriors, as real-world spaces are not designed for wall running. For this stage, terrain was used to create hills, and primitives were used like cliff faces for Gabby to run across, again allowing for plenty of opportunities for her to build momentum. When I first played these new stages, a sense of weightlessness rushed over me, as as if I had just been towed from development hell. These new stages were instantly more fun than the V-Slice stage we had made the month prior, and I knew instantly that this was the way to go. When I made my very first batch of stages at the beginning of development, I would use primitive cubes and cylinders and spent hours meticulously hand placing them in the scene. I would then go back and replace each individual shape with a textured mesh, which I had also made from scratch. This took considerable time, especially with kilometers of ground to cover. So how was it that my designer was able to block out 2 full-length stages in just 3 days? The answer is tools. To make these new stages, he created some quick blueprint tools to speed things along, using spline meshes to generate large strips of geometry that could be easily placed, modified, meshed, and textured. With these splines, environments could simply be drawn, rather than built brick by brick. He also made a decorative clutter tool, which would automatically populate a designated area with various meshes. While a lot of objects still needed to be hand-placed, the clutter tool greatly assisted. I had some friends playtest this laboratory stage, and predictably, they all reached the end in under 4 minutes, despite the stage being more than twice as large as the abandoned port. But when they reached the end, they played it again and again. And before I knew it, they had played it for over half an hour, testing different routes and trying to earn as much speed as possible and master Gabby's mechanics. And this is when I rediscovered what Project Feline was really about. All of my anxieties about game length and playtime washed away as it became apparent to me that players didn't really care if a stage was only 4 minutes. Some could clear it in under 50 seconds, but it took them hours of practice to get to that point. I realized that being able to complete stages quickly wasn't a bad thing, but in fact, a reward for masterful play. Every so often, I'll stumble across a video of someone speedrunning my game. I didn't pay a lot of attention to this at first, for I am not a speedrunner myself, but over time, I noticed that a lot of these videos took place in my very first stage, the Skyport. Up until recently, I was embarrassed by this stage due to how short it was, but for years, it had been the most popular stage in the community. I felt so silly that I didn't see it, but the solution to my problem was staring me right in the face the whole time. Only I was blind to it because I stopped paying attention to my players and got stuck in my own head, getting worked up over things I perceived as issues, which, to the players, were not issues at all. For a long time now, I've been hesitant to go back to these linear stages because of the months of development it would take me to design, mesh, and light a single 2-minute stage, and I was terrified of how much more time it would cost me to make even an hour's worth of content. This fear prompted me to explore alternatives, like Calder's Mission, the abandoned port, and this Tony Hawk's rabbit hole I had stumbled into. I think it goes without saying, but there is a lot more to game development than just programming, modeling, level design, and UV mapping. For me, a lot of the work is decision making. I believed that with enough planning and careful decision making, I could avoid facing challenges with level design by scoping the stages down to small, contained areas. But I learned that while these types of stages worked for Tony Hawk's, they just wouldn't work for Project Feline unless I were to completely change who Gabby was. I still have much to learn about level design, but I also don't know the first thing about making a pro skater trick system, and I had to choose which set of problems I would rather contend with. I chose to keep Gabby as she is, for if I had gone down the Tony Hawk's route, no progress would have been made on the level design, and I would currently be busy with another movement rework, putting the game even further behind schedule. So while this means Project Feline might be shorter in terms of pure level content, I believe this direction will be much more authentic and preserve what makes Gabby fun to play. Since making this decision to stick with primarily linear stages, a lot of progress has been made. Making stages is still a lot of work, but it's easier than ever with these new blueprint tools. We have also made tremendous progress with the art style, gameplay systems, and improvements to Gabby's mechanics to complement this new direction. But that's a story for another time. Wishlist Project Feline on Steam, and thank you so much to my channel members and patrons for supporting these episodes. You can become a supporter too, and in return receive exclusive behind-the-scenes updates every month, access to my private Discord, and early access to new devlog episodes. And patrons earn exclusive Project Feline merch like this shirt. Thank you so much for following my development journey, and I'll see you in the next one.